you fly into Vietnam in 1972.
Well, it was a long way getting there. I went
Yeah,
to Travis Air Force Base, to Anchorage, Alaska, to Yokota, Japan,
yeah,
to Clark Air Force Base in the Philippines, and I
right.
was delayed there by 3 days, so I had to spend 3 days in the Philippines.
Yeah,
And then I hopped on a C-130 and did what they call the milk run. And so we
yeah.
went to just about every base except my base.
Uh-huh.
We finally dropped me off later in the day.
In Danang?
Danang, right?
Yeah.
Monkey Mountain was uh, basically a mountain or a hill that overlooked the whole bay there.
That's up in the High
And,
Van Pass, isn't it?
right.
Yeah.
I was, at that time, I was a radar operator, and our radar site was up on Monkey Mountain.
Up by where those old French, the old French
Right.
fortress things are up there?
Well, yeah,
Or whatever the bunkers, the French bunkers up there, yeah.
bunkers. I wasn't there very long. We were actually packing stuff up and getting to move. I worked a lot with sensors, a lot as well.
Yeah.
And we moved all the equipment over to Nakhon Phanom over a period of about 4 months. And
In
then,
Laos.
it was actually on the Thai-Laos border.
Okay.
Nakhon Phanom is a little riverboat town,
Yeah.
northeast Thailand. It's
Yeah.
about, I don't know, 53, 54 miles away from the Mugia Pass, which is where all the action was going on.
Now, so let's. I mean, I'm interested. You read in memoirs about the High Van Pass, the ambushes, and all of this.
Mm-hmm.
Just how would you describe Danang, the High Van Pass, the High Van Pass, Monkey Mountain? How would you describe just kind of that whole scene that late in the war in 1972?
Well, keep in mind I was a teenager.
Right.
And I didn't know much from a hole in the ground.
Right.
When I arrived there, I was a little different than other airmen, probably because I had grown up internationally, basically. And so it wasn't really a shock to me to be living in another culture, another country. In fact, I kind of relished it a little bit.
Yeah.
A lot of my colleagues, though, about my age as well, were in total shock.
Just because of the cultural differences and
we all thought we were going to get shot,
Yeah, yeah.
and it turned out, not to be that bad. We drank a lot of beer and had a lot of good camaraderie.
Yeah.
That's what I remember the most.
Because at that stage, it's most of the fighting,
We were
the
bugging
majority
out.
of it's being done by South Vietnamese, right?
Right. In fact, almost all of it was.
Yeah.
We were a little worried about our perimeter, but we were concentrated on moving everything over to Thailand, and that's exactly what we did. We were kept very, very busy. I was a little disappointed because I wanted to go back to the States. I had a girlfriend at the time.
Yeah.
And so they said, no, the idea was we're not going to bring anybody over new. We're going to extend you in place. I think the military calls it stop loss right now.
Yeah.
So it was the older version of stop loss. We're going to keep you in country here and send you over to Nakhon Phanom, and it was supposed to be a 12-month remote tour of duty.
Yeah.
And it turned into 15 months. But
now, how long were you in Vietnam before you moved
4 months.
to Thailand? Huh?
It was 4 months.
4 months. Let me ask you one last question about Vietnam, and then I'd love to hear a little bit about this operation in Laos. Some of it may still be secret. I don't know what you're allowed to say, but
most of it is.
Okay, well, whatever you're allowed to say. But let me ask one more question about Vietnam. You've said you were young and, not plugged into all the details. But when you pulled out of Vietnam on your way to Thailand, After this conflict that in different ways had been really going on since the end of the Second World War, with the U.S. picking up in the early 60s,
Mm-hmm.
did you feel confident that South Vietnam would be able to stand on its own?
No,
No, why not?
not at all. Well, this is just anecdotal because, we all talk,
Sure.
and a lot of my colleagues, we just didn't trust the South Vietnamese. We thought they were bugging out themselves
Not
and
necessarily committed to the cause.
not committed to the cause.
Yeah.
And that worried a lot of people, in that they were supposed to have our backs. They were a lot of our outside security. And so, none of us had an ounce of proof,
Yeah.
but, we talked amongst ourselves, and we just didn't trust the South Vietnamese.
So this is why you said earlier that you weren't sure your perimeter was very secure, because that
Correct.
was being defended by the South.
Right. Unfortunately, we had the same type of perimeter at Nakhon Phanom. In fact, NKP, as they call it, was even a tighter perimeter.
Yeah. And was this Laotian forces then?
No, we had Tiger, what they called Tiger Patrol troops.
What was your perception of them?
They were badasses.
They're tough.
They're tough.
Okay.
And they had been used by, Nakhon Phanom was a special operations base used by a number of outfits, including the Green Berets and the CIA. And it stayed classified up until about 2011, I believe. In fact, I know that to be the case because in 2011, I was contacted by the Veterans Administration and told that the whole thing had been declassified, or parts of it had been declassified.
Okay.
The U.S. acknowledging that they had this secret base, right?
Yeah.
And, oh, by the way, we think that you've been exposed to Agent Orange.
Oh. Yeah.
And so I had to go down to Audie Murphy Hospital in San Antonio, Texas, and be assessed for Agent Orange, which is still in process right now.
So you still don't know if have you had any health issues that you?
Oh yeah, yeah. I've survived cancer. I had to have Roux-en-Y gastric bypass in 2012, a year later, because my entire endocrine system failed, and it was shutting down all my organs. So what they did, they gave me a Roux-en-Y gastric bypass that, about 90% of your hormones are produced in your duodenum.
Right.
And that was impacted by chemicals, and so my hormones were being disrupted. And it was a miracle. It saved my life, and according to my doctor.
Yeah.
And I've been pretty healthy ever since. So.
And you're pretty confident that these problems have some tie to Agent Orange?
Well, that's what my doctor says.
Yeah.
It was my doctor who, when I went through the VA system to be assessed, that said that you've been exposed.
Yeah.
NKP was one of the bases where the ranch hand aircraft were refilled with Agent Orange. We had Agent Orange. We actually used the barrels for trash cans in our hooches.
Oh wow! Oh gosh!
And
so they were also using Agent Orange in Laos then?
Oh yeah, yeah. It was mainly in Laos, but they used it at the camp also. It was a camp, Nakhon Phanom camp. We had kill zones around our perimeter, and they would use the Agent Orange to beat down the foliage in the jungle around our camp. Yeah. And so it's they added it to the list of Agent Orange sites late because of the classification of the site.
Yeah.
It supported most of what we call the Lima sites that were in Laos.
What were those?
A Lima site was a site run usually by the Air Force in Laos. Some of them were to support the Mao and Hmong tribes people who were basically on our side with everything from ammunition to beans and rice, Coca-Cola, you know.
Right, yeah.
We had one Lima site that was a radar site that extended coverage over Hanoi, and it was eventually overrun by the North Vietnamese, and some of our Air Force personnel there, special operations personnel, were killed. One of them, a Chief Master Sergeant, won the Congressional Medal of Honor during that particular operation.
It sounds like, you know, these operations are a primary purpose is still to, this is my sense of it, is still the primary purpose. You're in Laos now, but the primary purpose is to provide information to the government of South Vietnam that will then help it to deal with the Ho Chi Minh Trail, with gathering other information, that kind of thing?
No, when I was at Nakhon Phanom, it was purely us. You know, we were providing all kinds of information basically to the U.S. government about what was going on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And I'm sure at some point that was probably shared with the North Vietnamese government, or South Vietnamese, I'm sorry, government.
Yeah.
But I wasn't party to that. So I couldn't tell you for sure if that happened or not.
Yeah. And I understand you may not be able to answer some of these questions if some of it's still secret, but was some of that information used then, you know, given to the Air Force for bombing runs and things like that to know what areas to hit?
At that point, no, because we stopped bombing.
Okay.
At that point.
Yeah.
The only time that we would have any type of bombing like that was through our OV-10s, which was actually at Nakhon Phanom also, and the CIA Air America. Yeah, we actually shared facilities with Air America in Nakhon Phanom there. They had their own radar controllers, and they were basically assisting the tribes people in Laos at that time. And they were under attack often by the North Vietnamese and irregular forces of the North Vietnamese as well. And so occasionally you would have bombing runs. We did a lot of photo recon. In other words, we had a lot of photo recon aircraft that would, you know, monitor the trail. We had AC-130 gunships that would monitor the trail with their sensors.
Yeah.
But the interdiction phase of the war was basically suspended at that point in mass. You know, we used to put holes all over Laos. But from then on, it was mainly an operation to monitor the trail and to interdict anybody that's interfering with the tribes people.
I hear that.
When I retired, I signed a 50-year non-disclosure agreement. So there's some things that went on there that
you're still not able to.
That I'll be dead before I can even talk about it. But
maybe I'll catch you on the other side then.
Catch you on the other side. We'll talk about it. Yeah.
Let me ask you two more questions related to this. And I appreciate you taking the time to talk about this. Well, actually, well, okay. Let me ask this question. So you've got the sensors up, and you're gathering the intel related to, among other things, the Ho Chi Minh Trail. I just want to pass by you something I heard from another vet who was there during the time of the Easter offensive, and he said that you've got these sensors that can pick up tanks and, you know, big vehicles and so on.
That's what I worked on.
Okay, so what the NVA did, according to this account, and I think they did something similar before Dien Bien Phu as well back in '54, they would take the tank apart or take the big stuff apart, take it down the trail on bicycles, and then reassemble it. Does that sound right to you?
Well, yeah, they did some of that.
Yeah.
We weren't really much interested in that. The
Yeah.
sensors were basically inserted by air. They were probably about 4.5, 5 feet long. They had a whip antenna that would deploy, and it would bury itself into the ground, the main portion of it, like a spike.
Yeah.
And the
Yeah.
only thing would be sitting out would be a small wire antenna. And the computer that I worked on uh, basically received the data, transmitted data,
Okay.
and the computer, I mean, if we call it a computer today, it would
Right.
be
Yeah.
like laughable.
Right. Yeah.
But it could discern, even in those days, it could discern from audio or from vibration, um, but mainly by audio signature. What was
Okay.
passing it? It also had a voice, listening component to it, to where
Okay.
you could actually hear people talking,
Wow.
walking by.
Wow.
But the main thing was if a truck, we were looking for trucks mainly, because the trucks carry ammunition and supplies.
Right.
It doesn't matter if a tank's sitting on a truck or, or disassembled or assembled. We know something heavy is going by.
Okay.
If it's heavy from the sound signature, it is likely ammunition,
Yeah.
which is metal and very heavy, or it could be things like a disassembled tank. And so we pretty
Yeah.
much knew one thing from another. You
Sure.
could actually count people walking by, so you could get body counts on how many, what troop strengths are.
You could
Uh,
get that by like what? The sounds of feet going by or voices that you hear or that.
Voices here, but it'll also pick up sound of people walking. So,
And did you
we
did
were
you
mainly interested in the vehicles, because the
yeah,
vehicles were bringing in the
sure.
supplies. And it interfaced earlier in the war with our AC-130 gunships. Um, they they would take a lot of this information where these vehicles were, because they were after vehicles.
Right.
It's kind of hard to hit humans.
Yeah, yeah.
You could do it, I suppose, but they
Right.
were after interdicting the supplies coming into the South Vietnam area.
Yeah.
So they would use their sensors to find the information that was located by the sensors,
Yeah.
and they had the newer ones had these 105 millimeter howitzers in the back troop door,
Yeah.
and they could go down a line of trucks and put a shell in the back, or one in the cab, one in the back, and basically it was pretty devastating to the North Vietnamese.
Wow.
But all that ended, when the war stopped. We had a treaty with the North Vietnamese to stop that.
73.
We
Yeah.
followed it. They didn't.
Right. Yeah.
That was totally separate from protecting tribes people in Laos, which was, while they call that the secret war, it's not really tied to the Vietnam War, even though it is. And it went on for quite a while after the official
Well, yeah,
Vietnam War
'cause
left.
you said that after what did you say? 10 months or something in Vietnam? I forget the number of months you're in Vietnam.
4 months.
4 months, right? And then 15 over in Laos, roughly.
Right.
So yeah, that gets you past
Yeah.
the treaty of 73.
Right.
Yeah.
It
And
it went. Actually, I left in 74, and then everything kept going on until about, I'm not quite sure what the month was, in 1975. A lot of the units that I was involved with in the Camp Phan Nam were also involved in the Cambodian interdiction, where they captured some Americans.
yeah.
What was that called? The Mayaguez, I believe.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. I
It
know.
was under President Gerald Ford, I believe. Gerald Ford was the
Yeah.
president at the time.
So when you say that everything was going on still after 73, everything meaning
Laos.
and combat still, helping the Hmong and the others
Right.
to fight the
Correct.
NDA.
It was still going on all the way up to about 75, and my understanding is a lot of my particular unit pulled out in 1975 and came back to the States.
And that was before April 75 or after April 75 when Saigon fell in April?
I think it was April. It must have been April 75. I wasn't there at that time, so
I see.
I don't know the exact time after I left.
Just one last question. You have this pretty unusual experience of being in the Vietnam War, I mean, literally at the end.
Right.
There just aren't very many Americans, relative to 1968, there just aren't very many Americans there at that time. Based on what you saw, your 4 months in South Vietnam, up there, the Hai Van Pass, Danang area, and then sort of this, this related conflict in Laos. When you look back on that conflict, what's your sense of it now? We're almost 50 years down the road. You look back on it. What's your sense of that whole conflict? What it was about? What it meant? I mean, you're a professor. If suppose a student, just said, class is over in 2 minutes.
Right.
The student raises his hand and says, so, what was that war all about? What should I know about that war? What would you say?
Well, there's Dr. Mark Woodhull right now, and then there's Mark Woodhull as a little snot-nosed teenager, and we have different thinking at different periods in our life.
Sure.
And if I could morph myself back to that particular time, I was a pretty gung-ho guy. We were basically the formation of what is now the Special Operations organizations. We were called Air Commandos back then. And in fact, when I was there, we actually changed from Air Commando units to Special Operations units. They actually had made that change in 72, 73, 74, that area.
Yeah.
So I was so busy doing my job and relating with my fellow Air Force comrades, and having some good times and having some bad times, that I really didn't intellectually sit there and think about what maybe a lot of college students back in the United States were thinking or protesting. I had come from a university that really was fairly conservative. Kent State was a fairly conservative. That's why it was such a shock to a lot of the people at Kent State when we had a lot of activists from Michigan and other places showed up on our campus, and then of course the disaster that ensued.
1970,
But for the most part, most of us were, just good old American boys. And I kind of carried that with me over into Southeast Asia. And the war itself, of course, winding down, I felt that our government had abandoned us, basically. That, we were fighting the good fight. And you'll probably hear this from a lot of vets, that we're fighting the good fight, and then they pulled the rug out from underneath us, and we basically just left. I can't think of an operation that we didn't win, during that entire my experience. It's like we just picked up the tents and left.
Do you feel like that was? Because sometimes veterans will say that they also felt like, for all the criticisms you can make of the government of South Vietnam, they were an ally, and we kind of left them in the lurch as well. Do you also feel that, or
yeah, and I didn't really feel that until I actually came back, and I was my ex-wife. She's passed away now, but I had married a Laotian while I was there.
Is that right? Wow.
And so my wife was from Laos, and we agreed with the Catholic Charities, even though I'm not Catholic, to take in 3 refugees. After 75, when they started, coming to the United States, they were looking for sponsor families. So we took in 2 women and 1 man lived with us for 2 years.
Wow.
And that's when I started feeling that we had abandoned these people. The 2 women were basically students at the time when they left Vietnam. The man was actually an accountant.
Wow.
He was basically a professional.
Sure.
And their entire lives were just uprooted, and I wouldn't say destroyed, because they all moved out eventually to Huntington Beach, California.
Right.
And a big, huge Win Cow Key. I don't know if you remember Win Cow Key. Had set up, I don't know, pizza place or something out there in that area of California, and he was forming a Vietnamese community, and a lot of the Vietnamese refugees gravitated to that area, including the 3 that lived with me.
Wow.
And they all went out there. They wound up, the 2 girls wound up in college out there. They wound up as IT analysts.
Oh, yeah.
And I think last I heard they were working in Silicon Valley somewhere,
Right.
And of
almost
course,
the cliche of the
right.
Yeah.
So they all turned out well, but in 75, that area, I was really feeling kind of guilty as an American when I would interface with these Vietnamese. Like, I started feeling like we abandoned them. And it was very subtle. I mean, I can't point to anything specific that caused me to start thinking that. It was basically interaction with these 3 Vietnamese that lived in my house.
Now, these are Vietnamese who had been in Laos and then from Laos had...
No. Okay. These were Vietnamese that fled Vietnam in 1975 during the big exodus.
Sure,
And my understanding from them is that they had wound up in Nebraska.
Wow.
And at the time, I was I was going to college. I was stationed at Rosecrans Air Force Base in St. Joseph, Missouri. And they have Missouri Western State University there. And I started going to college again. I was, I think, 24, 25 years old by then. I told you my first attempt at college was a total disaster, my fault entirely. When I went back, you grew up real fast in Southeast Asia. And that certainly happened to me.
Sure.
And so when I went back to college, I remember the very first day I went into a classroom, and I'm looking around, and I'm not much older than the other students that are in there, but my attitude was, God, I'm in a classroom here with a bunch of kindergartners.
Yeah, I hear you.
And the maturity levels were just totally different.